Hello and welcome to episode number 218. This is the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com and I am Cornelius Fichtner. Nice to have you with us. What would you say if I told you that any project you lead is an intercultural project? Even if you have grown up in Paris and all the other project team members and stakeholders on the project are native Parisians as well, you will still have to deal with culture on your project. But before we get to that, I received several emails in the last month that made me raise an eyebrow. These emails were all from listeners like yourself telling me that they are enjoying all the interviews here on the program, that they have decided to take their PMP exam and asked if I offered any training for PMP exam preparation. And that last bit of the question there, that raised my eyebrow because for the last 5 years, in pretty much every episode here on the show, I have mentioned our sister podcast, the PM Prepcast. So, to be as blunt as I possibly can, yes, I do indeed offer PMP exam training via a video podcast. I've been doing that since 2006, and over 20,000 project managers have used my training in preparation for their PMP exam. So, if you yourself want to get PMP certified, then please stop by at pmprepcast.com and take a look. Thank you. And now, back to projects and culture. Karin Brünnemann specializes in consulting, project management, and training in intercultural and multinational contexts on a worldwide basis. She has lived in and led projects in more countries than I have fingers. So when it comes to projects, culture, and how to deal with that, she knows what she is talking about. In our interview, Karin and I will be answering the question, what is culture? Discuss some myths and mistakes in regards to culture, see how the iceberg model applies to culture, review the 2 high-level challenges that projects face in cultural regards, and we will look at 3 tools that will help you thrive in managing the culture on your project. And now, erase all your stereotypes and enjoy the interview.
Project Management Podcasts Feature Interview.
Today with Karin Brünnemann, PMP, Intercultural Expert.
Hallo Karin, herzlich willkommen zum Projektmanagement Podcast.
Hallo Cornelius.
Ja, freut mich, dass du hier bist. Very happy that you are here today, talking to us about intercultural project management, challenges and benefits. So let's start with the most obvious question here, because intercultural project management, always about culture. What is culture?
Well, culture is not only what we usually perceive as culture, that is nationality or race or ethnicity. It includes a vast categories of other things, such as, for example, a gender, the position you have in the company, if you're a CEO or an accountant, the education you have, which interest you have. Demographic factors play a very large role, not in that it makes a big difference if you're 50 or 52 years old, but for example, if you're a digital native or digital immigrant. And there is many, many more aspects that compose a person's culture.
Right. That basically then means that every project has to deal with culture.
Absolutely, yes.
All right. So there are some myths about culture and what people think about these. And you have done a presentation on this, and we are basing this interview on that presentation that you did for the PMI Slovakia chapter and the PMI Austria chapter. And here we have 4 of those myths and mistakes, and I'd like to read those to you, and then you can give us your thoughts about why these are myths and why they are wrong. So, one myth, people from my country have the same culture, people from other countries have a different culture.
Right. It might be on the first hand that we think if somebody looks different, if they're dressed different, if they eat different foods, that they are more different than the people who live around us. But for example, if I look back to my own childhood, I grew up with my parents' neighbor's daughter. She was my age. We played together, we went to school together. And I have now many more things in common with a random software developer from Bangladesh than with this girl I grew up with together because we went on different paths.
Right. The second myth here is culture is only about nationality or race.
Yeah, right. We have already touched a bit on that subject.
Yeah.
There is so many more things connected to culture than just if you're Swiss and I'm German.
The next myth we have is learning the do's and taboos of a country or region is sufficient preparation for working internationally.
Yeah, we see a lot of these cultural or cross-cultural, intercultural trainings on offer that teach you that it's not a good habit to blow your nose in Japan. While this is very important in general, it is not sufficient. There is much more to this, much deeper understanding that is required for a successful intercultural management than just these do's and taboos. They are important, though.
Right. And lastly, I've heard this so many times, you should just adapt to the other cultures.
Right. Imagine this situation. You're American, or you have an American passport now at least. You want to enter business negotiations with a Chinese person. So the Chinese learns about American culture, you learn about Chinese culture. The Chinese is sitting in the meeting behaving like an American, and you're sitting there behaving like a Chinese. I think makes it quite clear that this won't work. Of course, there is situations where it is a bit like that. If you have a customer in China and you go to China for a business meeting, everybody else is Chinese, then yes, it makes sense to adapt to a certain extent to that culture. But it's not the holy grail that you learn and you adapt to the other culture.
All right. What would you say is the single biggest mistakes that somebody can make in an intercultural encounter?
If they see or perceive something or somebody as different, to think it's deficient, to think something is not the way I'm used to it, so it must be bad or worse than my culture.
Right. We're moving on to the iceberg model. Everybody's probably heard of the iceberg model, 10% above the water, 90% below the water. How does that fit into intercultural project management?
Right. The iceberg model is really very old, but still it's quite useful if you want to explain the depth of cultures. So you have some visible things. For example, you have material things. You can see if somebody dresses differently, if they eat different food, what kind of art they're producing. You see another category that is on the social side, which language do they speak? Which institution do they have? Do they have a military government or democracy? Which rituals do they have? So this is above the surface, which is easily visible normally. But all the mental differences are really hidden below the surface. That the biggest issue below the surface is probably assumptions. We have assumptions about our own culture and we have assumptions about other people. And these assumptions are not always correct. And they're not obvious. So if we assume that, for example, a Japanese person will understand European humor, then we might be very wrong about that, but we don't see it. And if you imagine out in the Arctic Ocean, if two icebergs collide, they collide below the surface. And it's the same with cultures. You will hardly have any argument about which clothes are correct to wear or which food to eat. It's kind of really acceptable and you see the differences, but the way people think is totally different, and that's not obvious, and that is where cultures actually collide beyond the surface.
All right. So we've talked about culture, what it means, the myths, the iceberg model, the fact that they clash under the water, more on the mental level, really, than on the material, visible level that's above the ground. So, which additional challenges do we face managing intercultural projects in addition to the normal intercultural management?
Right. We can identify some external challenges and some internal challenges that are very specific to the area of project management. If I take one example for an external challenge we have in project management, a project as such has a culture, a project culture. Now, this project culture is not standing alone in empty space. It is influenced by the cultures of the team members that are working on this project. It is influenced by the culture of the company that this project is done for, or companies, can be more than one. And there is obviously, the project managers will know that there is a million other stakeholders that as groups also have cultures that influence my project. And to give you some examples, for a company culture and project culture difference, imagine the company culture is you have a line management, quite strictly organized, but in a project, you run a matrix organization. So there you already have a big difference. The management style might be totally different. There might be silo management in the company as such, but in the project manager is a very open person and they're flexible in their management styles and they're communicative across the silos. And all these can lead to irritation, to demotivation of the project team, and also to a lot of insecurity. People don't really know how to react and how to handle the situation. So that is quite a big challenge from the external side to the project.
Right. What about the internal challenges?
If we look at some internal challenges, one that I perceive almost all the time is that although the PMBOK guide says that you should really allow sufficient time and also sufficient budget to have kick-off meetings, to have team building sessions, there is usually in the real world not sufficient time and not sufficient funding for these activities. And whereas they usually make team building exercises on a very general level, there is nothing really done specifically addressing the intercultural differences, at least not what I have seen in my year-long practice. Another aspect that I often come across is that my projects, I have like 30, 40 people in them, and they all come from a different country. Some of them have migration background. And as we said before, there are different aspects to cultures than just nationality. So there is male and female team members, there is young, there is old ones, there is accountants, there is software developers. And usually there is only very little time or too little time to get to know all of these different cultures in depth. So as a project manager, you want some general tools and some general knowledge of how to deal with cultural differences in general, rather than how to deal with Chinese people or how to deal with older Italian women, so that you can still make your project turn out well.
All right. So we've learned a lot, I think, about the culture, the challenges we have, both internal and external. The title of our interview here talks about the benefits and challenges of intercultural project management. Now, can you bring everything together here? How the visible part of the iceberg, the invisible part of the iceberg, leads to benefits and challenges, and how you can survive and thrive in such an environment?
Yes, this is what I'm trying to do in my project. as we have said before, it's not just enough to learn the do's and taboos, because if you look at the benefits, this basically means you avoid problems. It's already quite good if you don't have problems, but this gets you somewhere to a line zero at best. But you want to benefit from the intercultural management of your team. You want to have more than zero. So most of the issues that lead you to zero are on the visible part of the iceberg, and the aspects that lead you to really benefit, to cash in on your diversity, they are hidden below the surface of the iceberg. And as you grow in intercultural maturity, you will be able to more and more thrive from the cultural differences that your project team and your settings offer you.
Oh, I see. So what you're saying is that while culture is a challenge, the things that are above the surface on the iceberg, they're usually easy to deal with and simple to deal with. And you can, focus on those and work with those, and you will survive the project, right? The project will go past. But if you are able to really deal with the items that are below the surface, the mental items, the assumptions, the values, the ways of thinking, knowledge, people, how they are on a more personal level. If you're able to bring this in, then your project will thrive because people will grow in their intercultural maturity. Is that it?
Yes, and you should really see some financial benefits from that as well.
All right. Cool. And of course, now comes the moment when we have to talk about the how this is being done. And you suggest three tools on a very high level. They are trust building, looking for commons, and finding the main difference. So let's take a look at these three individually here and see how we can do this. Let's start with trust building. What do we mean by that? How do we do it?
Yeah, Cornelius, I think you have right away picked out the most important tool.
Well, I'm following your outline here. It's not very difficult.
Right. Most of the thriving potential really revolves around building trust. And I would like to explain a bit more in depth what trust means in a project. First of all, we differentiate between cognitive trust and so-called affective trust. Cognitive trust means that you trust another person with their skills, with their abilities, with their reliability to do a certain task, to complete a subtask in a project or whatever. On the affective side, that's more about the emotions that that you think your project manager has your personal well-being in his interest, that he's not cheating, that he's not going behind your back or trying to do anything bad to you. So I would say it's one thing, for example, maybe a German engineer, you trust them that they have the capacity to build a new car that works. The other thing is, you from a specific person privately buy a used car? Do you trust them as a person, not in their work environment, in their actual skills? So, and where we can really cash in is on the affective side. We people, human beings, have normally a certain distrust of things and also of people we don't know, which is particularly relevant if we meet people from other cultures. They dress differently, they behave differently, they speak a different language, so we are normally not really sure what to make of them. So there is always like a hidden distrust, which is evolutionary, and we can't do anything about that. But the most important thing is that we become aware of it, so we can change our own thinking towards that person. I have been asked last time I did my talk if this can also be the reverse, that somebody doesn't trust his own culture or people from his own surroundings. And it made me think of some funny experience I had once when I was on holiday in Albania. I have rented a car, which I thought was very brave to drive around in Tirana. And my worry was I had to fill up the car. I had run out of gas and I had to go to a petrol station. And the Albanian language is not really similar to anything known. So I wasn't really sure if I would even be able to find out the correct type of petrol I had to put in. But then, to my surprise, I came to this petrol station. Everything was in German. And I filled up my car, and in the evening, I asked my Albanian friend, "Well, how do you guys figure this out? And why is it everything in German and not in Albanian?" And he just said, "Well, nobody would trust it. Nobody would buy petrol if things were in Albanian."
Wow.
So this is also one example of that trust can also take the other way, that we trust the other culture more than our own, but that is rather the exception, but it can happen.
Right. So if I understand correctly, the whole trust building is more about you. So you have to show others that you are trustworthy and therefore that they build trust with you because you're pretty much the only person you can change, right?
Yes,
So
correct.
you have to be the trustworthy person. And of course, in a project environment, you would, at the beginning of this, you would do intercultural training and being trustworthy and how to, you know, create trust among the team members would be part of this training, right?
Right.
Okay,
Correct.
good. The second tool that you suggest is looking for commons. Now, can you explain what you mean by commons and how we look for them and find them?
Yes. If we look at an individual person, maybe from another culture, we cannot attribute all differences that this person and I have to cultural differences because we're dealing with individuals, we're dealing with people. And there is no black and white between what is an individual's personal behavior and what is a cultural difference. It's like a continuum. It's somewhere on a sliding scale. So we have to be aware that we cannot just attribute every single misunderstanding or every single difference between two people from different culture to really cultural differences, but there's people differences as well. And the other aspect is that every individual is usually a member of more than one cultural group. You have a nationality, you have a profession, um, you have a company culture, and company culture can be very different in a small 2-3 people family enterprise than in a Fortune 500 global firm. There is the class, there is your education background, there is your gender, there is also special interest, if you like to play football or basketball. And amongst all these cultural groups, I suggest that you find some common ground with your project team members. That can be you all like to play football, you all like to eat Indian food, you're all in the same profession, you all have been to university, something like that. So just don't look on the differences, start finding similarities, and you will already have a common ground. And on this ground, again, you can start building trust.
So you're saying the common ground that we find about among our team members is the sort of the initial foundation for our common project culture then.
Yes,
Okay.
that's likely, it's like the least common denominator.
All right. Wonderful. Let me make a quick detour here before we go on to the third and final tool that you suggest. What's your personal interest in intercultural project management? How did you get into it and what do you do with it today?
Right. I got into it because my work, I'm originally from logistics, supply chain, and IT background. I'm a PMP since a couple of years. And my projects have taken me all around the world. And I have, up to now, lived in 6 countries. I have studied in 3 countries on 3 different continents. I have worked in 20 countries and I have so far traveled to 39 countries, and I'm still adding to all 4 lists. So I have seen a lot traveling around and experiencing to work and to live in other countries, in other cultures, on different continents. And I I have learned as I went along that many of the problems the projects were facing were actually due to cultural issues, that they have not been addressed correctly, people were not trained correctly, and assumptions have been made that were simply not true. And therefore, I have thought that I could help other companies in getting better at that, in avoiding problems and cashing in on their diversity in terms of culture. And so nowadays I'm doing training, consulting, project management in intercultural context.
Oh, so I can hire you.
You can hire me, yes.
Lovely. So what will you do for me if I hire you and bring you onto my project?
Um, I can offer you a variety of services. I can, for example, do some intercultural team building activities to see that you're on common ground and have a common understanding. I can actually manage your projects that take place on an international level, and I can do training, cultural training for specific regions or countries, or general training as we do now, to get a basic understanding of what is required of a project manager or any manager in international business endeavors.
All right, perfect. And I guess that as part of that consulting that you do there, you will also employ the third tool that you suggest. And that third tool is find the main difference. Now, the second tool was looking for the commonalities. And now
Yes.
the third tool is find the main difference. Now, why would I want to find the main difference? What does that help me do?
Um, it's basically with 20% of the differences, you can solve 80% of the problems. It's the good old Pareto efficiency. So by focusing and explicitly talking about these differences, I give you an example. Germans, although I'm an exception, Germans have the reputation of always being very punctual. And
You were on time for the interview today. No problem.
yes, because I studied intercultural management, and I knew that you expected me to be on.
Well, I'm from Switzerland. We invented time. We're even more punctual.
Yes. And in Latin American culture, time doesn't play such an important role, or rather, they have a different perception of time. They are on event time, whereas we are on clock time. So it was very funny. I was living in Colombia for 1 year, and my best friend, Colombian, and me, German, it was just the other way around. He was always on time. I was always late. He was the one that was really organized. I was always a bit, oh, I haven't planned that yet. So, so far for intercultural stereotypes and individual differences. But anyway, if you know that there is really big differences between some cultures, for example, British people, they are extremely polite. And if you are asked by a British project manager, oh, could you maybe do that once you get some time, if you don't mind? Well, they really mean is, I need this right now. But we have to be aware of that. So if you just address the two or three biggest differences you expect to have in a project with the cultures involved, and I would highly recommend that you do this in your kickoff session or in a specific team session, that everybody can actually bring their concerns on the table. Then you can make agreements. Then you can say, hey, we have an agreement on time. If we say a meeting will take place at 2:00, it will take place at 2:00, and not somewhere between 2:30 and 3:30. So once these things are out on the table, you can actually make agreements. You can make agreements that the British people, they should be a bit more specific about what they need and when they need it. And that, for example, the Chinese, when they say yes, it has a different meaning than our yes. When we say yes, we mean that we agree to something. When the Chinese person in negotiation says yes, they mean, right, I've heard you, I understand what you want. A yes is not an agreement. And we need to be aware of these major differences, and then we can ask the Chinese supplier, when you say yes, do you mean a Chinese yes or a European yes? And when you've been talking about these things before, then they will not be offended.
Right. Okay, wonderful. So we have those three tools. First of all, we started with trust building more on a personal and interpersonal level. Then we looked for the commons, and those commonalities, they create the foundation for the culture that we have. And then the third major tool is to find the top differences that we have and then bridging those differences. Now, let me move on to the final question for you here, Karin, and this might be a very difficult one. Can you give us your top maybe 2 to 3 tips and suggestions for our listeners here? Project managers, many of them who have intercultural projects, what can they do tomorrow on their projects to make the, intercultural issues and problems go away?
One of the top advices I would give here to start with is that you become aware of your own culture. Reflect on your own assumptions. What is maybe so obvious in your culture that you don't even think about it? Like it's totally obvious that we eat meat, for example. It's totally obvious that we are on time. So think about your own culture. What makes up your culture? How would you describe your culture to another person who has never been to your country, who has a different job, who, if you're a male, who is female, or vice versa? And then try to reflect on this and try to understand, how can other people perceive these elements of my own culture? What will they think about it? Will they recognize my cultural assumptions? And maybe a second tip I can give to the listeners here is, since we have already established that trust is so extremely important, think of how you can build trust with your team, how you can. Because, as you said earlier on, Cornelius, very rightly so, you need to advance. You need to be the one showing people that they can trust you. You can't just demand trust from your team. And you can also not blindly trust everyone on your team. But if you think about a couple of things that maybe even in connection with specific people, what can I do that this person will trust me? Then I think you're already 3 steps ahead of everyone else.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time, Karin, and talking to us about the topic of intercultural project management, its challenges and its benefits. Thanks for being here today.
It's been a pleasure, Cornelius.
And that was our discussion with Karin Brünnemann on the challenges and benefits of culture on our projects. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. As always, you can find us on the web at pm-podcast.com. And following up on what I said in the opening of this episode, and for all those of you who are currently preparing for their PMP exam, please don't forget I am a professional PMP trainer and I do offer a PMP video podcast. So if you are a project manager who wants to become a PMP, then the easiest way to do so is with our sister podcast, the Project Management Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching over 42 hours of video training from pmprepcast.com. Please send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com, and when you write, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. It's another popular saying that we twisted to project management purposes. The saying is, first things first. And in the project management context, it becomes first things first, except when fast tracking. Until next time.